Let's begin by asking a question that seems simple but carries immense depth. Who or what are you really? Are you the thoughts running through your mind, the sensations in your body, the voice inside your head that seems to narrate your life? For most of us, the answer seems obvious. I am this person, we say. I am this body, this mind, this identity. But what if this understanding of self, this I that we carry so closely, is not what it seems? What if it's just a habit of thought, a belief that doesn't reflect the deeper reality of who we are? This is where we need to look closely at three terms: the finite mind, the ego, and the separate self. These aren't just abstract concepts. They point to something deeply practical, something that shapes the way we experience life, the way we relate to others, and the way we respond to challenges. Let's start with the finite mind. The finite mind is the lens through which consciousness, the infinite formless awareness that is the ground of all being, takes on a particular perspective. It's what allows consciousness to localize, to focus, to perceive a world of objects and events. Without the finite mind, consciousness would remain undifferentiated, pure awareness with no experience of form. The finite mind is what enables consciousness to play, to create, to engage with the richness of life. Think of it as the role an actor assumes on stage. The actor isn't the character they're playing, but the character allows the actor to fully inhabit the story. But here's the important part. The finite mind, in and of itself, is not the problem. It's a necessary function, a tool that consciousness uses to experience life. It's not inherently tied to suffering or conflict. The problem arises when we become identified with the finite mind, when we mistake it for the whole of who we are. This identification is what we call the ego. The ego is not a thing. It's not an entity lurking somewhere inside us. It's an activity, a movement of thought and feeling that says, I am this body, I am this mind, I am separate from everything else. It's the belief that the finite perspective of the mind is all there is, that the localized experience of me is separate from the whole. The ego thrives on this belief, and it uses it to create a sense of identity. I am the one who does, who controls, who fixes. It builds narratives about itself, stories of success and failure, of victimhood and heroism, and then defends those stories at all costs. The separate self is the illusion created by this activity. It's the idea that I am a distinct, isolated being, navigating a world of objects and other separate selves. It feels real because it's reinforced by our experience. You see a world out there, which seems to confirm that you're in here. But when we look deeply, this separation starts to dissolve. Here's where things get profound. The separate self is not an entity. It's a belief. It's a habit of thought that overlays the raw, direct experience of life. And because it's a belief, it's not permanent. It can dissolve when we see through it. When that happens, something remarkable becomes clear. The finite mind is not who you are. It's a role you play, a perspective you inhabit, but it's not the totality of your being. Now let's consider why this matters. Most of us spend our lives caught in the activity of the ego, constantly trying to protect, assert, or prove the separate self. This creates endless struggles. When you believe you're separate, the world feels like a threat. You're constantly striving for security, for recognition, for control. And yet, no matter how much you achieve, the sense of lack remains. Why? Because the ego's fundamental premise, that you are a separate, finite being, is false. It's trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist. But here's the good news. You don't need to get rid of the finite mind to be free of the ego. You can still have finite experiences, as we all do every day, without believing that you are a finite being. You can play the role without forgetting that you're the actor. This is the shift from identification to clarity. Clarity is the state of seeing things as they are. without the distortions of egoic belief. It's recognizing that the finite mind is a tool, not an identity. It's understanding that while consciousness takes on the appearance of a localized self, it is never confined by it. From this clarity, you see that the same consciousness flowing through you flows through everyone and everything. The boundaries between self and other, between me and not me, begin to dissolve. This realization doesn't make life passive or disengaged. In fact, it does the opposite. When you're no longer burdened by the need to defend or assert the ego, you can engage with life more fully, more openly. Challenges arise, and you address them, not as a crisis of self, but as part of the natural flow of experience. Whether you act or refrain from acting, your response comes from a place of stillness and wisdom, not fear or reactivity. Here's an analogy that might help. Imagine a wave on the ocean. The wave has its own form, its own motion, its own perspective, but it's never separate from the ocean. It's made of the same water, moved by the same forces. The wave's individuality is real, but it's not separate. The finite mind is like the wave. It gives consciousness a particular form, a particular perspective. But the idea that the wave is separate from the ocean, that's the illusion. And when the wave sees through that illusion, it doesn't disappear. It simply knows itself as part of the whole. When you stop identifying with the ego, the same thing happens. You don't lose your individuality. You don't stop being you. But you realize that this you is not separate. It's a temporary form, a perspective, through which the infinite expresses itself. This realization brings a profound sense of freedom. You no longer feel the need to protect the ego, because you see that what you are cannot be harmed. You no longer feel the need to prove yourself, because you see that what you are cannot be diminished. And in that freedom, life becomes lighter, freer, and more open. This is why clarity matters. It's not about transcending life or escaping the finite. It's about seeing life clearly, seeing the finite as an expression of the infinite, the wave as an expression of the ocean. From this clarity, love and compassion arise naturally. You see that the boundaries separating you from others were never real. You see that the same awareness shining through your eyes shines through theirs. And in that seeing, the world becomes not a collection of separate parts, but a seamless whole. So, is the ego the same as the separate self? Not quite. The ego is the activity of identifying with the finite mind. The separate self is the illusion created by that activity. And the finite mind itself, it's the character that consciousness plays, the tool it uses to experience the world. When we see this clearly, we can live fully as the finite mind, engaging with life's joys and challenges, while knowing that what we are is infinite. That's the beauty of this realization. It doesn't take us out of life. It brings us more deeply into it, with a freedom and openness that comes from knowing we were never truly separate to begin with.